Okay. As just noted, there is no handout, so I am giving away my psycholinguistic background already. However, if you would like a copy of the slides, please feel free to email me, and I will be happy to give them to you. So I'm calling this Individual Differences Inform the Syntax Processing Island Debate, but by the end, we're also going to see looking at the syntax processing island debate is going to inform our understanding of individual differences as well. So continuing in our psycholinguistic part of this afternoon, we're going to be looking at working memory and how it interacts with linguistic data. Now, working memory or some type of processing or parsing story has been invoked early on in the study of syntactic theory, for example, in center embedding sentences. If we have something like, the dog, the rat, the cat, ate, scared, ran, I have no idea what that means, and I wrote it. And the claim is that this is just too much for the memory system to handle. And if you draw out the tree, you can show that it is technically grammatical, but it's going to be unacceptable to a number of native speakers. And Chomsky even says that language aren't designed for parsability. So the basic question leading into this is, can this same type of approach be applied to island phenomena? So in order to look at this, I'm going to step through 4 different things. First, do a quick review of kind of the main approach to working memory applied to islands from Klunder and Kudus, and then review a recent study from Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips that tried to test this type of approach, looking at covariation with individual differences. Then, from some criticisms that I have of that study, I'm going to introduce a different view of working memory in sentence processing, and then I'll show you my new study that tests that view of working memory as well as the Klunder and Kudus view. So, when we're talking about processing accounts or working memory in islands, most of the time what people are talking about is a constrained capacity account. And like I said, this is from Klunder and Kudus, also used by Hofmeister and Ivan Sag. And the basic idea is kind of simple, that an excessive strain on the working memory results in ungrammaticality. What's key is what the notion of working memory is here. So their notion of working memory comes from the Justin Carpenter model, where there's a single resource that's used both for storage and computation. So if we look at, for example, these weather islands, we're going to be looking at weather islands throughout this talk. We have the weather islands on the bottom. If I use this pointer, can you guys follow that? So we have the weather islands here and the non-weather islands control. When we have the filler, this type of theory is going to say, well, I've got a filler, I've got to put this in storage. I know I'm going to need to associate this with a gap later on. So this filler goes into storage. And then as the processing of the sentence continues, the island condition here is going to result in more difficult computation. And this combination of holding an item in storage and difficulty of computation is basically going to stress the working memory capacity such that the results are deemed unacceptable. So from this view, if working memory is a capacity for storage and computation, to the extent that we have measures that can identify individuals with higher or lower amounts of capacity, they should be able to be seen to process island phenomena differently. So the question then is, do we see this kind of covariation of individual working memory measures and acceptability ratings for islands? And this is exactly what Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips set out to test. So they point out that an island violation is an interaction of 2 phenomena. We have the extraction, and also that extraction has to come out of a certain structure. So here, the weather phrase. And pulling apart these 2 factors, they come up with their experimental materials. So breaking this up between a short and long extraction condition, where the short extraction is just a subject extraction here, and then the long extraction is going to come from this lower clause. And then the subordinate clause is either going to be a non-island condition or an island condition. So we have something like the short non-island being, who thinks that John bought a car, compared to the long island condition, what do you wonder whether John bought? So what they are measuring in the reactions to these is something called a difference in difference score. And what this essentially is the size of the interaction of the island effect. So if we look over at the B chart here, what this means is the difference between the long conditions, the island long condition and the non-island long condition, is larger than the difference between the short conditions. And the amount to which this effect is larger, that's the interaction. That's what's measured by the DD score. So in A, we see a situation that has no interaction. This would have a DD score of 0, where this would have a positive DD score. So crucially for Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips, the island effect is crucially this kind of statistical interaction. And that's going to be one of my criticisms later, but this is what they're measuring. What are they measuring this against? They're measuring this against two different cognitive measures, a serial recall task and an MBAC task. So let me just run through these briefly so you have an idea of what kind of torture these subjects are being put through. In the serial recall task, it's actually fairly straightforward. This one is one of the nicest ones you can have. The subject gets a series of words. Here are some examples. And they have to, after the list of words is presented to them, repeat them back in order. And the in order part is going to be crucial because they're going to be the same words being used over and over and over again. So you have to recall the order of the words. The NBAC task is one of the most frustrating tasks you can do as a psychology student undergrad. And what you're going to do is you have to look at the letter on the screen currently and respond yes or no whether it matches the letter that you saw N slides ago. So for example, if you see this sequence of letters, L, L, K, L, Z, K, now you wouldn't see these all on the screen at the same time. You'd see them one at a time, and each one would replace the next. And there's a hash mark in between so you can tell that it's a new L and not the same L that you're seeing before. In a one-back task, if you saw this first L, you don't say anything because there was nothing before it. On the second L, you say yes, because this matches what you saw one back ago. In a two-back task, you don't say yes until you get to this third L here, because this matches what you saw 2 slides ago. Now you can imagine as N increases, it basically goes up to 4, and then people's brains kind of shut down. Usually that actually happens at 3. The number of dependencies that you are holding simultaneously increases, and they're overlapping, and it's a very difficult measure. So this is going to be kind of a recognition updating measure. So, to get to the punchline, Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips compare this DD score with these two working memory measures and find no robust effects. From this, they conclude that the constrained capacity account of islands is not supported. Okay? So, I have a couple of issues with this. Now, I'm going to have these issues now, but I'll give you a little spoiler in that the experiment that I have is basically going to agree with Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips. So you can take these issues with a slight grain of salt if you like. First of all, they compared only the statistical interaction, just this DD score, to the working memory tasks. And in the flavor of this being a workshop, this is something that I would actually like to pose to the audience and ask you if you think that it's necessary in this type of paradigm for it to be a statistical interaction to show an island effect. So Ross in 1987 characterizes unacceptability or ungrammaticality as kind of the accumulation of small problems that eventually pass a threshold. So if we can just see that the island violation condition passes a threshold rather than as a statistical interaction, is that good enough? Second issue is that, as was just mentioned in the previous talk rightly, null effects are very difficult to interpret. So they found nothing, so they claim that there's no support for the capacity constrained approach. They go a step further and basically treat that as support for the grammatical approach. But it's not clear that they had enough statistical power, for example, to see the effects that they wanted. And additionally, they measured working memory with 2 different tasks, but neither of these included an interference-based task. And I'm going to explain why that might be important in just a little bit. So, addressing these issues, here's the picture that should have been up while I was talking about it last time. If we don't worry so much about a statistical interaction and just think about a threshold, if, say, this threshold, right around 0, These are z-scores, so 0 is going to be kind of the middle of where you're rating things. If the island violation condition is below that threshold, is that enough for us to consider this an island violation? If this were not an experimental approach, certainly. So there's kind of a confound, I think, translating what is obviously the interaction of conditions, the extraction and the presence of the island structure, into the vocabulary of kind of psycholinguistics and wanting a statistical interaction. This may or may not be. Honestly, I'm kind of on the fence on it myself, so if you guys have feedback, I'd love to hear about it. So what am I going to do about that? What I'm going to do about that is not only measure the interaction, but measure also the main effects of extraction itself and the presence or absence of the island, as well as measure the scores given just to the island's violation condition. So each of these points here on the graph represent a range of scores. So we could, just as easily as asking if the interaction covaries with these working memory measures, do the range of scores given to this island violation condition covary with the working memory measures. Second issue about null effects being difficult to interpret. Well, Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips, following Klunger and Kudis, state that there are effects of processing trying to talk too fast. Processing extractions and island structures each individually tax working memory. Right? That's what the constrained capacity approach says. These two things together combine and it's too much for the system. But additionally, each of those parts in and of themselves is a working memory phenomena. If that's so, if we measure them separately and look for covariation separately, we should be able to see that. And all that gets washed out when you only look at a DD score. So perhaps, working memory effects can't be observed in acceptability judgments. If that's the case, we're not going to see effects anywhere. But if we see effects in any one of these domains, we can better interpret any results where we don't find things. So we're going to look at extraction, the island structure, and the interaction between them. And third, they didn't include interference as a working memory task. The reason this is important is just as we have seen already throughout this conference, there's more than one kind of grammatical or syntactic approach to islands. There can be more than one processing or working memory-based approach. So Klunger and Kudis, as I've mentioned, is a constrained capacity view of working memory. Another major view that's being developed is that of working memory in terms of similarity-based interference. So we're going to include a memory interference task to try to probe that as well. So let me do a brief little overview of what the similarity-based interference view looks like and how it might apply to islands before jumping into the current experiment. So this is the same slide that we saw before for the constrained capacity accounts, and it focuses on storage and computation. And if this is taxed too much, we're going to get ungrammaticality. In the similarity-based interference accounts, also, too much strain on working memory is going to result in ungrammaticality, but that characterization of what working memory is very different. So in this view, words consist of bundles of features, and these features can, at this point in the development of the theory, more or less be anything you can think of that is appropriate to syntactic theory. You can have, lexical features, phonological features. You can have any number of features, and it's not well defined yet which features matter most for similarity-based interference. This is still kind of an open issue. But what happens is words are identified by these features, and there's no active storage component. So in these same examples that we had before, you're not going to actively hold this filler in memory. You're not going to do anything special with who compared to what you do with did or bill. You're going to encounter this word, you're going to encounter the next word. If it turns out that you need it later, what you're going to do is go back and get it via content addressable memory. Content addressable means you are looking for something with a particular feature. So that's why these bundles of features are important. So imagine these sentences in the think that case, you get to the gap, you realize, okay, I need a filler to go with this gap. I need something with a plus WH feature. So you go into your recent memory and you pluck out who, you integrate it, everything's happy. However, in the weather island, you get to the gap, you need something with a plus WH feature, and you can get similarity-based interference between the who and the weather. Now, it can be a plus WH feature, it can be some type of phonological overlap, it can be combinations of these things. We're going to have a little bit at the end to say about what might be relevant, but this is still somewhat in its infancy as far as what type of features are most relevant. So these two approaches, though, have the opportunity to have measurable differences between them, where similarity-based interference, unsurprisingly, invokes a notion of similarity-based interference, where constrained capacity counts don't. So we can discern this using a working memory task that includes similarity-based interference and compare that with one that doesn't. And likewise, constrained capacity accounts have an active memory cost, where the similarity-based interference accounts don't, and the verbal span is a task that has been used and encourages this type of active memory cost strategy. So let's go on to the current experiment. First, a couple of methodological things to get out of the way. I ran 81 subjects and gave them all 4 different working memory and attention tasks. They're going to be rating sentences on a 7-point Likert scale on paper and pencil. And just like Sprouse, Wages, and Phillips, we're going to manipulate extraction distance, long and short, times the presence or absence of the island structure. They're going to see 8 items per condition for 32 items, 168 fillers. And it's going to be in a Latin square design plus reversing for order controls, and we're going to get 8 lists out of that. So just as a reminder, some improvements that we're making on the Sprouse, Wages, and Phillips paper is that we're going to be analyzing all the factors and conditions, not just the interaction. We're adding additional individual differences measures, specifically with the aim of tapping into this other working memory theory. And something that I haven't mentioned yet is that the materials are designed to extend to future self-paced reading and ERP experiments, and that basically amounts to sentence position controls. So, the types of working memory measures that they got. The NBAC, which we've talked about previously, this is basically kind of a general level, not really specific to verbal ability working memory measure. A verbal span task, which has been used since Justin Carpenter as part of the constrained capacity approach. A memory interference task with both semantic and phonological lures that is going to attempt to tap into the similarity-based interference, and then a flanker task, which is a pure attention task. And the reason that this is in here is because the similarity-based interference approach, or view to working memory, relies on selective attention, but only in the confines of memory. So this is basically in here as a check. So this is selective attention without any memory component. So we've talked about the MBAC already, so I'm not going to go over that again. Verbal span, you may be familiar with. What happens is subjects have to read aloud a number of sentences, and then at the end of the block of sentences, they are to repeat the last word of each sentence. And reading these sentences aloud prevents them from doing any type of rehearsal strategy, where they might do something like, okay, John saw Mary at the train station, 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 got it. As soon as you finish station, you get the next sentence and you have to read it aloud. So you don't have time to do any of that kind of rehearsal. So you're trying to hold on to station and then spring as you are processing the next sentences. And you have to process them in order to read them aloud. So this has been designed specifically to target verbal working memory capacity, and the size of the number of sentences that you're trying to recall the last word of in a block increases, and your score is based on the highest you can get, basically. For the memory interference task, this is going to be a study and test list task, where subjects are first going to see words on the screen for 1.5 seconds each, and they're going to be told, okay, remember these words. Then there's going to be a test list after that, where they're going to see a number of words, and they have to respond yes or no. That was on the list that I was told to remember or not. So if we work on this from the bottom up, if they see pineapple in the test list, and that was on their study list, they should say yes. If they see boat on the test list, and that wasn't on the study list, they should say no. The interesting action happens when we get to something like we see glass on the test list. Now, glass was not on the study list, but grass was. So we have the possibility for them to say yes to glass, even though they didn't see that, if they're susceptible to phonological or possibly in this case, orthographical lures, since it's visually presented. And similarly, with a semantic associate, they might say yes to cheetah, even though what they actually studied was jaguar. So if they are susceptible to this type of interference, they're going to make mistakes here. And then the flanker attention task, like I said, is a pure attention task. It doesn't actually end up figuring in on any of this, so I'm not going to go over it in detail. So here are the materials, or examples of them. And we have the same type of conditions as Sprouse, Widgers, and Phillips. So we have something like, who had on Tuesday assumes that the decorator annoyed the carpenter when the deadline was missed, is the nice condition. The not nice condition in 4 is, who had the carpenter inquired whether the decorator annoyed on Tuesday when the deadline was missed. Now you will probably note that the difference in here from the Sprouse, Widgers, and Phillips sentences is this insertion of the on Tuesday here. And this is the sentence position control that I was talking about earlier. So when we port these out to a future self-paced reading and ERP experiment, we want all of these different words to be in the same sentence position for various reasons. And a separate test experiment manipulating whether or not these on Tuesday insertions were present or not shows that there's no difference in the ratings given to these sentences. So we can make some general predictions, pretty vanilla stuff. We're going to see that the short extractions are rated higher than the long extractions. We're going to see that sentences involving non-islands constructions are rated higher than islands constructions. And we're going to see that the islands violation in 4 is deemed least acceptable. Nothing too surprising. All of these are borne out, with a slight snag in the islands condition situation, where while it was rated the lowest, it's not a clear statistical interaction. So remember that I was asking earlier about whether a statistical action is really needed. So the interaction is statistically significant by items, but not by subjects. And when you do an ANOVA, you ideally want to see statistical significance both by subjects and items. So it's not clear to what extent this should be worried about. We should be worried about this depending on to what extent we want to force islands to have statistical interactions. But these are kind of the uninteresting results. Here's a nice picture of it, and the results are presented here on the 7-point scale, but everything was run with z-scores also, with normalized data, same pattern of results. That'll be true for the results coming up also. Where the action is we want to see how do these things interact with working memory, or the working memory measures, rather. So we're going to do multiple ANOVAs for each of these different type of measures and see what does or doesn't interact. And to do this, we're going to break up participants into low and high scoring groups for each of these measures. And that's going to be formed by median split. So if we jump right into the results, we get no covariation for the interaction. This would be the equivalent of the DD measure. This is what Sprouse, Widgers, and Phillips also didn't find. We find no effects for the comparison of the presence of island structure versus the lack of island structure. We do get covariation with the distance manipulation, whether it's a long or a short distance extraction. So on one level, we've replicated Sprouse, Widgers, and Phillips. We see that we can say that the constrained capacity account isn't supported because we don't have covariation of the relevant verbal span measures with this interaction. And that's what they were looking for. Additionally, our similarity-based interference account did not vary with this interaction. So that doesn't seem to be driving the island effects either. But nicely, we do have this distance manipulation, and we can actually get a lot out of that. So it turns out that it is that memory interference task that is co-varying with the extraction distance manipulation. Specifically, this is being driven by the phonological or orthographic lores. There's a lot of numbers on this page, so let me just go straight to the picture. So what we have here are the high-scoring individuals on the left. And remember, in this task, a high-scoring individual is one who is not susceptible to similarity-based interference, or at least not as susceptible. So they were not tricked, basically, is what it amounts to. And the low-scoring individuals were tricked. So they're susceptible to the similarity-based interference. Now, the solid line here are the long-distance extraction, which by all assumptions in psycholinguistics are the more difficult sentences to process. And that's borne out in them being given lower ratings. So that's not surprising. But what might be surprising is that the high-scoring individuals, those that aren't tricked, don't do any better on those sentences. Right? They're rating these sentences the same as the low-scoring individuals. What happens, actually, is it seems that the low-scoring individuals do worse on the easier sentences. So, this lack of boost for the high scorers in the difficult condition, but a penalty for the low scorers in the easier condition, has been previously reported in the ERP literature. And I'm just going to show you one briefly to give you a flavor for what this looks like. Whoops. So this is King and Kudus, 1995, and here we're comparing subject relatives and object relatives. And here we have good comprehenders and poor comprehenders, defined basically just how well they responded on comprehension questions. Now, in the ERP literature, ease of processing is associated with what's known as a slow positive drift. So here in the good comprehenders, we can see that this trace, the lower one, is getting progressively more positive. Positive is plotted down, negative is plotted up, excuse me. So this solid line on the bottom are the easy subject-relative sentences. This line up here, this dotted line, I'm not sure if you can see the dots, is the more difficult object-relative sentences, and then the shading just shows the difference between them. So the good comprehenders show this ease of processing for the easy sentences, not so easy for the more difficult sentences. The poor comprehenders aren't showing ease of processing for either of them. So rather than in these working memory manipulations seeing boosts for the higher scoring groups, what we actually end up seeing is a penalty for the lower scoring groups. So what might this mean? Let me put two thoughts out there. The high scorers are not differentiating themselves from low scorers in the difficult conditions. So we could think that the difficult conditions are just too difficult for everyone to process, right? It's just beyond the range of the working memory system, however you might want to categorize that. For example, nobody is really expected to be able to parse 4 levels of center embedding, right? Presumably, you weren't too good at the 3 levels on the first slide. If you are, I might want to run an experiment on you. The kind of more common assumption, though, is that the limit on these difficult sentences is grammatical rather than processing related. So we see little differences between groups in the difficult sentences, which have been claimed to have a grammatical bases by a number of theoreticians. We do see differences, however, in these easier sentences, which, to my knowledge, nobody is really claiming are being limited by the grammar itself. So 2 possible options. So to summarize the findings, just in terms of raw, this is what we found without any type of interpretation, and comparing 4 different cognitive measures of individual variation, none of them covaried with the ratings of the island violation effect, either those ratings of that condition itself or the interactions. Only one of these measures, the memory recall task, specifically the phonological subportion of it, covaried with the extraction distance manipulation. So, what can we pull from this? Well, while Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips presented null results and concluded that the constrained capacity approach to islands is not supported, we can actually go one better than that. Maybe 2, depending on how you count. Since we found positive results, one we show that it is possible to detect this type of covariation between cognitive measures and linguistic acceptability judgments. In addition, since we're able to find these positive results, the null results that we find are more easy to be interpreted. It's still better to get positive results than null results, but it's much less of a concern in this experiment that it's a lack of power issue, since we've demonstrated the power to get the covariation in the extraction situation. Now, the lack of influence of these individual measures on the island violation conditions indicates a lack of support not only for the constrained capacity approach, but also this more recent approach that I sketched out for you, the similarity-based interference approach. So neither of these seem to be looking too good at this point. And finally, two finalies, the positive results from the memory interference covariation tells us something about the character of working memory in terms of processing long-distance dependencies. So it indicates the importance of this similarity-based interference idea. Even if it's not specific to islands, it's still important to processing. So in looking at islands, we've learned something about the working memory system, or at least hints of it, guides for further research. And finally, as I had mentioned before, the specific type of features that the similarity-based interference account uses, they're not locked down yet. But the fact that we saw an effect with the phonological rather than the semantic lures gives us a footing to move forward to some other experiments. We could ask, is the phonological shape a cue to a plus WH feature? Obviously, not all islands are going to have intervening weathers in them, so we want to look at different island types and see if we get different types of results. Does the phonological lure still matter? And would non-WH dependencies provide different results? So those are things that we're looking at doing in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question related to center embedding and so on, because from an intuitive point of view, it seems that if you compare, for instance, sentences with center embedding in Japanese and Basque, they seem to be easier to be processed in Japanese than in Basque. So you can have, a sequence of subjects in Japanese and they seem to be okay, whereas sentences like that are not very good in Basque, for instance, right? And I was wondering whether you could say something, about cases like that. It also relates to the fact, some of the points that you mentioned at the end, what is the role that phonology would play? And also, if you look at languages which are supposed to be head final, for some of these languages, there are many people that have proposed that you have more complex sentence derivations where sometimes you have some type of remnant movement or something like that, and how would that interfere in the type of analysis that you are proposing here?
Okay, so in terms of the center embedding, if I understood correctly, you're asking, you're saying there are some languages which are going to allow center embedding more easily than others? Is that the... Right, so that would basically, if that's the case, and we don't want to claim that speakers of Japanese or Basque are just phenomenally better in terms of their working memory than anybody else, maybe the ploy that I used as the introduction is not actually the right way to go, right? Maybe it shouldn't have been said that the reason these center embedding sentences are bad is because of working memory limitations. And in fact, if you take some of these center embedding ones, I picked a bad example, a very ungrammatical example on purpose in order to make a point, but you can play around with varying the finiteness and the definiteness of various things. And if you get something like, I don't know if I can do this off the top of my head, it still hurts a little bit. The woman everybody I know invited, I'm falling apart. But if you give me a minute and let me write it down, you can play with it even in English and get them to be better. So in response to that, I would say that even in the center embedding cases, it seems that working memory is not the complete story, or it needs to be tempered with these different types of finiteness manipulations or definite manipulations, which may or may not be built into some of the examples in Basque and Japanese. I'd have to look at them. In terms of the head final processing, it would definitely make very different predictions in terms of processing. But in terms of what I'm presenting here, basically what I've presented is showing that this type of exploration doesn't support these type of processing accounts of islands. So I don't know that anything extra needs to be said in terms of the individual differences account for those head final languages. But there are definitely differences in processing strategies and parsing strategies that have been proposed for head final languages.
I was wondering if you found any order of presentation effects on your...
No, I didn't.
Because in the satiation literature, weather islands are especially prone to change in acceptability over...
Yeah, so I did not find any, let me qualify that. I did not find any list order effects. So when I set these up, I actually have them set up to be able to look at satiation, but I haven't done that yet. So the way I have them set up is there are 8 examples of each sentence type, and I have the list set up into 8 blocks, such there's only 1 example on each block. And then if I look by blocks, I can check that, but I haven't done that yet.
It would be interesting to...
Mm-hmm. The people that ask a lot of questions have to sit closer together.
I'm wondering what so these similarity-based interference models are very much relativized what syntacticians call relativized minimality in a sense, right? Except without any structure, without any further structure to the list. So would the prediction have been? So suppose you'd found. This is highly hypothetical, but I just want to understand the logic of the situation. So suppose you'd found an effect of a correlation between this similarity-based interference task with the island effect specifically. Would you have had an expectation that just having some WH word linearly intervening between the extraction site and the gap without forming an island, that would have interfered in the same way?
So
comparing something like the WH, like the weather islands that you had, with something like what did the question of whether climate change is man-made fishing for a verb that's plausible. Which decisions did the question of whether climate change is man-made influence?
So before I address that, let me make it the distinction kind of one level deeper. If you're comparing it to something like relativized minimality but without structure, the similarity-based interference group actually explicitly states that the linear order doesn't matter. So what they're going for is they're specifically doing this thing called content addressable memory. So it doesn't matter where in the order it happens, except there is a decay function built in. So older things will be less active and more difficult to retrieve. So in terms of would there be an effect of some other WH word that is not an island, the presumed answer would be yes, but not necessarily an effect so big that it makes everything horrible. So you can have similarity-based interference where all it does is slow the process down. And it's going to basically make that retrieval of the proper lexical item more difficult. But you can imagine those two items might be similar only in certain features where the island is also has a feature that incorporates its sentential structural position, which is something that they include, kind of like an LFG type of feature bundle, where it says, you know, and I'm in this structural position. So that would have additional overlap, and so that might cause while they would both be problematic, one would be more problematic than the other.
We should close the session, I think. Will you back at